Hey guys, how are you? This is your lecture on Futurism. Typically, I very much look forward to coming down and doing this in person with you, but as you know, exorbitant airfare would not allow us to be together for this lecture this semester. So, what I'm going to do today is do a very quick, abbreviated version of this so that you have the information you need for the next test. I'll also put up some typical takeaways for this lecture. And then when we are back together on December 19th, I'm going to build in about 30 minutes before we start our presentations to just kind of summarize the course and really talk about how things like the most recent election for president of the United States is going to affect the trends that we're all forecasting for the 1 or 2 years ahead. So, for now, this will be kind of our short version of what futurism is and what a futurist does. So, let's just go through this. You can learn a little bit about that. This is a great quote that I think I mentioned on the first day of class, but it certainly warrants repeating for this. Become friends with people who aren't your age. Hang out with people whose first language isn't the same as yours. Get to know someone who doesn't come from your social class. This is how you see the world. This is how you grow. And again, I just want to reiterate that the point of this course for you, it would make me very happy if you tell me a year from now that you certainly learned how to step outside of your comfort zone. And that's how you become a better creative person once you get into the industry. Also, there's a lot of things that we're going to discuss when I'm down. Again, it goes back to the election, but it's so true. But, the previous quote, let's go back to that about how you're supposed to kind of be away from people that are just like you, certainly warrants repeating, no matter if you're conservative or if you're a liberal. I think that in this election, we were all very guilty of kind of surrounding ourselves with polls that agree with us, following social media that agrees with us. And so that is why a lot of people were very disappointed in how the election turned out, because it's very much kind of what they call a media diet. And you were getting a one sided view of the world because that's how we typically surround ourselves. So we all were actually a little guilty of that. And I want to bring that back around once we're together on the 19th and talk about how that affects fashion as well. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Um, what I want to say first is that the future is something that has always been around. Even the very first human beings on this earth, the future affected them as well. It's pretty much one of the only constants in our culture, and it continues to inspire. People always wonder what's to come, what's going to happen tomorrow. The unknown is what drives imagination, innovation, and it's what causes people to take risk. It's responsible for newness and excitement. Looking at this slide, you're going to see pretty much some of the first writers like Isaac Asimov, George Orwell, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, these really great sci fi writers. They are considered to be kind of the first futurists. They were the ones who really were looking to see what would happen in the world. Sometimes it was a very dark version of the world, sometimes it was a very interesting and innovative version of the world. You'll see here that George Orwell famously said in 1984, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. And many people resonate with that quote after the election of the last couple of weeks. Again, look at the bottom right. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. There's a photo here for you to see. This is from one of the earlier sci fi works and their version of what they thought education would be like in the year 2000. I think pretty much you can see their opinion is that students would be very much like robots being brainwashed with information. For anyone that's familiar with classic rock, if you ever listen to The Wall by Pink Floyd, you'll know, of course, they had a very strong opinion about institutional education and how it creates a generation of sameness. So those were other versions of the future. So we could look at writers, we can look at musicians, we can look at artists. It definitely varies, but everyone has this very common opinion that the future is something that's very exciting and interesting. So let's look at some of these major points. When did futurism begin? So most people agree that In the United States, at least, the formal study of the future began with World War II. There was a man named Herman Kahn, Kahn, and he had an organization called RAND, RAND. It was a global policy think tank. And at that time in the 1940s, he started using scenarios to explore the consequences of nuclear war. So, after that, the 1960s saw the emergence of several consulting firms and think tanks that were focusing on the future. The World Future Society was one of the first groups, and they are actually still around today. So, what is a futurist? A futurist is a professional who studies the future in order to help people understand, anticipate, prepare for, and gain advantage from coming changes. I want you to understand that it is not the goal of a futurist to predict what will happen in the future. Instead, this person uses foresight to describe what could happen in the future, and in some cases, what should happen in the future. Typically, a futurist is called upon to help make a decision, solve a problem, adapt to a coming change, or they often will identify paths towards innovation, how to get somewhere that you want to go. This is very different from a trend forecaster. I'm typically a trend forecaster, so I'm looking at, 2 to 4 years in the future. Also, I'm looking at, popular culture, things like technology, fashion. A futurist is they are very involved with very large picture macro trends. And often they will work for government agencies, Fortune 500 companies like Apple, Coke, IBM. They also work for religious organizations like the Catholic Church. And also, they will often have their own consulting business. The reason why we are doing a lecture on futurism when we're fashion majors is that I kind of want you to understand the bigger picture of what trend forecasting feeds from, and that is futurism. Okay, so let's also take a look at some other ways that we would describe a futurist. A futurist is more likely to say how or why a future could appear rather than to say what the future will be. So, in that way, you can almost say they're a little bit unbiased in what the future will be. One of the founding principles of the field of future studies is the area of personal and organizational choice. So, although the future is unknown, none of us know what's going to happen tomorrow, in a month, in a year, in a decade, a person can identify possibilities, select the most favorable outcomes, and then attempt to influence events to create their desired future. So, this is what you would consider a power shift of sorts. Most futurists look 10 to 20 years in the future for their focus. And I actually want you to think back for just a second 10 to 20 years in the past and everything that has happened in a decade. So it's 2016. Let's go back to 2006. So most of you were probably right around being 12 or 13 years old. If you could have imagined 10 years ago everything that has happened since then, a woman running for president and almost winning, smartphones being created and pretty much taking over our entire world. There's so many things we can look back to and say, wow, I would have never thought that could have happened. So, really, my point is don't ever underestimate what can happen in that amount of time. We think 10 years is a very long time, but you know what? It's really not. And so much can happen in 10 to 20 years. Let's look at the futurist analytical process. So it includes 5 steps. These 5 steps are very similar to kind of the steps that we went over with trend forecasting the first day of class. Number 1 is framing. A futurist needs to frame the current state of affairs and understand what's going on in the world. Next, number 2 is visioning. You want to be open to the range of possibilities. What could happen? Number 3 is describing. This is explaining or reporting on possible futures. There could be very few possible futures, or there could be many possible futures. Number 4 is scanning, looking for indications of the future. This is just like what we do in trend forecasting. And finally, number 5 is planning. You want to create or implement a future direction. Let's go back to number 4 really quickly, scanning. There's 2 types of scanning. The first is studying the very broad trends that are shaping our world. And in fact, futurists use an acronym called STEEP, STEEP, and that stands for Society, Technology, economic, environmental, political, steep. And they use these forces to categorize information. The combination of steep trends paint a picture of the direction and the expectations of our future. So futurists use a very broad view of the world to help understand the interactions between events. The second type of scanning looks for anomalies or unusual events that may provide an indication or of change or a solid piece of evidence for an emerging trend. And those are called weak signals. So those aren't as important, those are more subtle. Okay? Both types of scanning require futurists to be information sponges. And this is exactly what I've been trying to teach you in this course, that your eyes and ears need to be open to every single thing that could be happening in the world, no matter if it personally affects you or not. All right, let's go back to the very bottom of the slide. What is backcasting? Okay, this is very, very interesting. So we've been looking at forecasting, right? Trend forecasting. And that's, of course, looking to the future and what could happen, anticipating it. Often, what a futurist will do is what's called backcasting. What they'll do is identify steps that must take place to get to a preferred future. Okay, so you're working backwards to make something become reality. So once you have an idea of what needs to happen, you then begin to plan how to make each step along the way take you in the right direction. So it's important to understand that not all views of the future are dark and dystopian. In fact, most people's ideas of the future through the years have been very enlightening, very positive, very colorful. So let's look here first to the 1960s. The 1960s was a major time of cultural and societal change. Demographics were changing, people were being opened up more to globalism, international travel, different kinds of foods. So they were certainly anticipating what the future would be. And their version of the future was around, let's say, the 90s to 2000 to 2010. So here are some photos for you. There was very much a lot of emphasis on space age fashion in the 1960s. Paco Rabanne, Pierre Cardin, these were some designers that had a very plastic, colorful version of the future. There also were a lot of TV shows and popular culture affecting people's interpretation of the future. Shows like Star Trek, The Jetsons. As I said, there was an increase of global travel. People were flying more readily in airplanes to other countries. There was a lot of future inspired architecture, um, brutalism, and other things. You can still see a lot of those if you come to New York even today. And then also there was a New York World's Fair in 1964 that was also very inspiring for what was going to happen in the future. So this is just some really funny comic book versions of what people thought the future would be. I think this comes from a publication in the 1960s. So I just want to show you that a lot of times people certainly overestimate what's going to happen in the future. Uh, by 2016, someone thought man's intelligence and intellect will be able to be increased by drugs and by linking human brains directly to computers. Well, listen, that's not too far off, especially how we're always connected to our smartphones. But then again, there was someone on the far right that thought that our New Year's Day dinner in 2056 would be cooked by robots, served by friendly, intelligent animals, bred and trained as household helpers. This seems a little silly, but we also need to look at things like artificial intelligence. Many of you are probably watching shows like Westworld. There's also Humans on AMC. So, artificial intelligence is certainly becoming a more important conversation. So, again, 2056 is what, 30 years off? Um, right? Yeah, that's 40 years off, something like that. So, it's not too far out of the realm of possibility to say that in 40 years, artificial intelligence may create robots that certainly are cooking our meals. Bottom left corner, by 1986, much of the world's food will be synthetic, factory made, and by 2006, you may telephone your vote to a capital control computer on every law. That has not happened yet. People are very afraid of technology affecting the outcome of the election, as you just saw 2 weeks ago. But certainly, much of our food is made by ingredients that are made in laboratories that are synthetic. And I think you have seen in the last few years that with stores like Whole Foods and even Trader Joe's, there's been a huge backlash to that and really trying to once again inject very natural ingredients into foods. Here are a few more examples. Um, Also, in the 60s, they thought by the year 2000 we would be eating all of our meals from capsules. So here's an example of that. They thought machines would make our foods out of like little pods, kind of like how we make our coffee every morning. And the reason why we don't eat our food from tablets is that we're still humans. We still want to enjoy the things that we taste. We want to feel good things. We want to see beautiful things. So, what I want you to understand is that no matter what the version of the future, we're still humans at the end of the day. And you can never underestimate the importance of being a human and wanting to be connected to our sensors, see, touch, feel, etc. So, no matter what, being human is always going to keep ourselves in check when it comes to the innovation that's going to affect us for the future. Looking at the next slide, this was actually a version of education. Many people thought that by now we would be able to see our teacher or our professor from many miles away. Guess what? We're doing that. So we are living, breathing examples of that. Also, if you see here on the bottom right corner, this was how many people envisioned the way that we would learn in the 60s. And I think that's definitely come true in many ways, using technology, utilizing it in every step of our day. And then also, this is another version of that, seeing how education could be utilized from a long distance version. So next slide is a video I just want to play really quickly. This is a video that was made in the 60s looking at how women and men in the typical household would be affected by computers. So let's watch it really quickly and then we'll discuss.
Fingertip shopping will be one of the many homemakers' conveniences. This video console will be channeled into the store of her choice. There, a camera will scan a display of wares, which she will select by push button. Another part of this console is a household monitor screen, which maintains a watch on critical areas in the house, swimming pool, or yard. What the wife selects on her console will be paid for by the husband at his counterpart console. All bills and transactions will be carried out electronically. A central bank computer will debit the family's account the amount of purchases and credit the department store, for example, informing the family's home computer at the same time. Father, at the touch of a button, receives an instantaneous printed copy of his budget, the amount of taxes he owes, the payments left on the car, and so forth. All documents and household records are available on the video screen for immediate reference. Also at his disposal is an electronic correspondence machine, or home post office, which allows for instant written communication between individuals anywhere in the world. To maintain these and hundreds of complex electronic circuits, a monitor checks all circuits every few seconds, inserts a backup circuit if and when trouble develops, and alerts the communal service agency for replacement.
So, let's not even worry about how misogynistic the video is, thinking that the woman shops and the man pays for it. But it is very interesting for them to see that they thought computers would be such a large and important part of the daily lives of your home. Everything from being able to bring up clothing to shop for, paying for your bills. So, again, this was in, I think, 1966 when they made that, when computers really were first starting to be an influential force in culture. So it's very interesting that this is the Jetsons. I really love the fact that I'm sure you've seen Jetsons when you were a kid, and I really love the fact that, of course, they were on to technology like the wrist TV or watch, ways to do laundry, ways to commute, even using robots to make your lives easier. There's the Apple Watch, which was certainly forecasted from the Jetsons in the 60s. The next thing I want to do is look at the 80s. The 80s also had a very optimistic version of what the future would be, which was very interesting because we were dealing with communism and foes like Russia at that time. So there were a lot of people that had very dark versions of the future, and popular culture still had a hold on very optimistic things of the future. So looking at the Back to the Future 2, the sequel, there were a lot of very interesting things that have now become reality. They were, of course, looking at how nostalgic the 80s would be in the future, and they are. We had things like hoverboards, which we now have. We had a lot of really interesting technology when it comes to gaming, which we certainly have. I also want to look here at like things like the Nike. Those of you that ever watched the movie, you know that it was a self-lacing Nike. Nike finally was able to put it out into retail just, I think, about 2 months ago. You can now buy for a very hefty sum of money the self-lacing Nike, which is very cool. Also, they were looking at things about how 3D would affect both our pop culture, like movies, as well as things like printing. Also, I wanted to bring this slide in. Many of you have seen this meme floating around on Facebook or Instagram, but in the year 2000, The Simpsons had an episode where Donald Trump ran for president. You can see that his slogan at that time was "America, you can keep my ex-wife." Uh, but it's really funny that basically image by image it came true. Him going down the gold escalator, running for president, all the outlandish things that he said. And so the reason why I wanted to put this slide in is that a lot of times people will kind of poo poo pop culture and its importance to what's going on in the world. But you know what? Pop culture, whether it's a book, whether it's a TV show, whether it's a movie, whether it's a new album by Tribe Called Quest, they are hooked in to our fears as society, the things that we're excited about, that we're happy about. So I don't think you can ever discount popular culture and how great of an indicator of what 10 to 20 years down the line could possibly be. The Simpsons is certainly a great version of that. And listen, you can actually go and Google and find the entire episode from 2000 to see how realistic it really has become. So this takes us to something very important, and these are the drivers of consumer behavior. This is kind of the Bible of being a trend forecaster or a futurist. There are 9 keys to emerging consumer behavior, according to a very well known book called Harness the Future. There are 5 leading drivers: economy, technology, globalization, government, and environment. And then those go with 4 responsive drivers: demographics, consumer psyche, wellness, health and wellness, and retail. So those 4 responsive drivers are a result of what happens in the 5 leading drivers. Together, those are consumer behavior. So when you do your culture project, you will be looking at a topic that comes from one of these 9 indicators of consumer behavior. So, our final part of this lecture today is to look at some contemporary futurists of today. This is an article from about 2 years ago in Details magazine, and I just kind of wanted to show you different versions of futurists. I will send you this article so you can kind of see, but there are many here. You'll notice that most of them, what they have in common is they're old white men, 50s and up. There's one guy who's young, who's in his 30s. His name is Jason Silva. He is personally my favorite futurist. I'm going to send you his YouTube channel and a group of links for you to watch. He used to be married to Heather Graham, the actress. He has a show on Nat Geo that you may have seen called Brain Games, I believe it's called. Anyway, super cool guy. And he really is a very positive, very jovial version of the future. He actually does videos very often. You should also follow him on Instagram. Um, if you're a woman or you're a gay guy, you're probably going to think he's super hot as well, which certainly helps get him lots of speaking engagements around the world. But I'm going to send you some links so you can watch some of his little quick futuristic interpretations of the world. And I want you to be really inspired by it because I think he's super cool as well. So, in closing, what I really want you to get from this class, and I said it on the first day, so I'm just reiterating what I've said before, is that I want to encourage you as creative professionals to really step up, be gatekeepers of the future. I want you to help drive innovation by encouraging others to push the envelope and step to the edge of that comfort zone. I want you to be well rounded. I want you to strive to experience all parts of the world and culture, not just those that you agree with, not just those that you are used to, but the other side as well. I want you to be a citizen of the world, be a citizen of the industry in order to really help shape others' perception of the future. Because no matter what job that you guys get, an editor, a buyer, a merchandiser, a blogger, it doesn't matter. You're going to have a say in how you shape consumers' version of the future. And so that's why I'm bringing it back to something very non fashiony, but to really look at futurism as a whole and how that it's going to affect everything that we do, everything that we listen to, everything that we ingest as food and drink, everywhere that we travel. This is all important stuff. So, on that note, that's all we have for this. We're going to meet again on the December 19th. And before we do our presentations, we're going to have about 30 minutes to carve to really talk about how this class has affected um, your versions of the future, how something big like the election that just occurred affected your forecast. So I'll kind of help kind of bring it all back home again. But this was just a way for you to be up on your knowledge of what futurism is. Uh, I will also be sending a separate email today with this link so that you can see what's left for you to do for your presentation on December 19th. If you have any questions about this lecture, by all means, feel free to email me. I'm going to put up some takeaways so that you have all the bullet points from this PowerPoint as well. And then, other than that, I will see you on December 19th.